Hello and welcome to another episode of Grit and Glamour. My name is Ruby Veridiano, your host, and on today's show, we're going to be talking about intersectional sustainability and how we can play a part in voting it into our lives with the upcoming U.S. elections. My guest today is actually one of the first people that I heard the term intersectional sustainability from, so I'm particularly excited to have her on the show and to have this conversation with her. Aditi Meyer is a photojournalist, a fashion blogger, and a speaker on sustainability and social justice. And I love that she's in this space because she's really shifting the narrative and inspiring all of us to connect the dots between environmentalism and racial justice. Aditi is also also has a website called anime.com, which is a fantastic go-to resource to learn more about the subject. And her work as a photojournalist explores themes of labor and identity, where she's covered stories such as those of undocumented garment workers in her hometown of Los Angeles, California. I really appreciate her work and inspired by her. So excited to welcome her on the show. So without further ado, let's bring Aditi on.
Hi, Ruby. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, Aditi, so nice to see you. I believe you're streaming in from Los Angeles.
Yes, it's a cloudy day. It's a cloudy, muggy day here in Los Angeles. I'm just chilling in front of my couch on my living room floor, getting some good light.
It's so funny because it's like the LA Paris thing. You could see that the seasons are very different, even though we're in the same month.
Oh, wow. Is it nice and sunny in Paris right now?
No, what I mean is, like, I know it's sunny there. It's cloudy and rainy and proper fall weather.
Yeah.
But I hope that things in LA have recovered a little bit from the wildfires.
Yeah, I mean, it was wild. I was in Yosemite National Park when the wildfire, or one of the wildfires, the Creek Fire, which is now it's still burning as we speak, taking like the third largest fire in California history that's recorded. And so I left Yosemite because it was essentially raining ash, drove down to LA and saw basically every fire that was burning throughout California. It was so apocalyptic, but it's improved a bit, but I think it was a very explicit nod to the realities of the climate catastrophe as well.
Yeah, you're literally like right in the thick of it. But I'm glad that you're safe and that things are lifting and that you can go outside. So I'm happy to have you on the show. And as I was telling you, I'm so excited to have seen the growth in the last 2 years, because 2 years ago you were having lunch with me here in Paris, and so much has happened since then. And before we go into the meat of today's topic, I really want to get to the grit behind all the glamour, right? Because I think there are people who are watching your journey, who are inspired by you and who love all the beautiful photos that you take, of course. But I'm sure that there's so many unglamorous things that you have to do behind the scenes to really set yourself up for success. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, most definitely. Well, I had my start in this space almost 7 years ago, 2013 going on 2014. And as much as like the traditional, fashion blogger narrative is something along the lines of, I always had a passion for fashion, that wasn't really me. My passion was always storytelling through photography, and designs and aesthetics were just some of the ways I could explore my cultural identity and things like that. But my work in the space was really catalyzed from understanding fashion's disproportionate impact on people of color globally, especially women of color. And it was catalyzed specifically by the Rana Plaza factory collapse. And so I think, seeing an 8-story garment factory producing for some of the world's biggest fast fashion names and seeing it come down, as far as how that intersected with my own identity, being a South Asian woman. And so I think that kind of established an identity-based approach to this work of understanding that, yes, I am interrogating systems, but it's also a very deeply personal work of unpacking, histories of colonialism and unlearning a lot of these colonial mindsets, as far as how we understand consumption, how we view labor, and who is behind that labor. But in terms of the creative work, one silver lining, I would say, is I started as a freshman in college. So one plus is I didn't necessarily have to go into creating this creative body of work or this blog, which was literally created at 3 a.m. one day as a freshman before going into college. And I really had no idea what I was doing, to be really quite honest with you. But I think the beauty of that was throughout my college career and throughout those next 4 or 5 years, it was kind of like a living organism that was, in real time kind of reflecting my growing nuanced understanding of what sustainability is and what it should be. And so my vantage point was very much informed by a lack of diversity in the spaces that I would go to, often being the only woman of color in the room, say for maybe, blown up images of black and white images of like the global south that needs to be saved by your purchases. And so I found it quite problematic, and a lot of this sustainability and ethics lacked that context of why these systems were predicated in this way. And so I think there was a lot of almost imposter syndrome, for lack of a better word, because the voice that I was trying to inject in the space didn't exist, and it was often undermined. Conversations of race and identity were seen as distractions to this movement. And I think beyond that, the other grit is just, navigating capitalism as a freelance creative. I think probably in the last year is the first time I honestly feel like, okay, I know what I'm doing. There's a sense of stability to this. And so that, goes to show is almost like 6 years. And granted, I had the privilege of still like kind of figuring it out as a college student before. But I think that's a lot of the realities of just navigating this world and always asserting your worth, both as a creative, as a woman of color, whose goal is essentially to disrupt a space that has been led by homogeneously well-off white people.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I commend you so much for being brave and continuing to push for that representation. And I love that your voice is so much more visible these days. It's continuing to, I'm someone that has studied this, but I love that I get insights from you as well, because it really, I think, creates a domino effect in the industry. So thank you for being brave and courageous. I'm sure that wasn't easy in the beginning, but of course now these voices are a lot more accepted, I guess, right? There's a lot more people who are actually thinking that sustainability is a real priority. Similar to you, I started also like transitioning into this industry in 2013, 2014. And when people found out that this is what I wanted to focus my master's degree in, a lot of people thought I was wasting my time. So it's a very interesting, and I also love that you said that really it's been in the last year that you feel like you've seen the growth and the groundswell, because I think a lot of times people think that success can come instantly, especially in social media where things go viral, right? I love that you said that it really took you about 6 years to kind of get it right. And it's a really good reminder for people who are creating something that they believe in, that things take time. So I appreciate that. But did you, in the beginning of your journey, did you set out to be an influencer, or is that something that kind of happened accidentally, or just as a, unexpected byproduct of the work that you were doing? And, whether or not you did, what do you feel is unique about your approach to storytelling as an influencer? Because obviously I know, looking from different fashion influencers as a journalist, I've got a lot of, fashion bloggers and influencers, and you're one of my favorites for obvious reasons. But I would love to kind of hear from your perspective, like how you have landed on your lens.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I don't necessarily think that was the goal, is to be an influencer. I also think, there's a certain connotation around that word where the central goal is to sell someone something. But I also think as a culture, as a society in this moment, there's like a critical cultural juncture where true influence is more about like critical thinking and things like that. But my goal was always, in the most general sense, to be a storyteller in this space. I went to school for journalism. And so the goal was, how to kind of complicate the narrative and inject those voices that haven't been a part of the mainstream sustainability narrative, but have always been doing this work. And so the way that translated into the work that I was doing is, studying journalism during my college years, and a lot of the body of work that I was producing was a lot with the garment industry here in LA. But I think with the blog, because it was a kind of manifestation of my own personal experience in this space, I kind of became like the main character. And I think the nature of blogging and, online spaces, having a real person as an intermediary to like experience and unpack these issues with, make it a lot more personable. And it's something that I enjoyed. I think there was a lot of unlearning I had to do of an industry especially with journalism, that makes you feel like if you're not doing it XYZ way, especially as a woman in this space that enjoys things like fashion that have historically been undermined and seen as frivolous, there's a lot, we have to kind of do to be like, no, it's not frivolous. It's tied to the politics of labor, environmental degradation and things like that. And so I think I've come to a point where I'm just kind of embracing all of these identities. Some people can call it influencer, content creator. I still do freelance, journalism too, and then also labor organizing. But on that front, I think another thing I had to unlearn was in journalism school that was taught by nearly all white men professors, the idea that was constantly established was objectivity, author-subject relationship, and that distance. And as much, facts are facts, and I'm not going to debate that, but I think there's something to be said about historically the way journalism has operated and who has told these stories. Objectivity has often meant white men's subjectivity. And my approach to storytelling, I think I've always wanted to be rooted in establishing more, what's the word I'm looking for? More concrete relationships with the folks whose stories I want to tell. And especially reporting in the context of, downtown LA with largely undocumented community, like questions of consent and making sure that I'm not doing more harm with the storytelling is key. And so, all of those things inform my work. But I will say that the nature through which people consume content through Instagram and like me being that medium, it ends up being my face a lot of the time. And I'm okay with that. Just different forms of storytelling and getting the message out at the end of the day.
Yeah, totally. And I love that you also talked about a little bit about your studies. Just to insert really quickly, because I love that you come from a journalism school, but also what are some of the kind of majors that you would recommend to somebody who wants to follow a similar path as you?
Oh, that's a good question. So I personally doubled in international studies and literary journalism, which is essentially creative nonfiction, long form reporting. And my minor was digital filmmaking. So that's kind of like the storytelling aspect. Yeah. So for other folks that are interested in this space, I mean, obviously understanding global systems is important, right? I think something like international studies, political science is key. If you want to go to the route of storytelling, obviously journalism, but also like having a lot of that foundation in the science around like environmental studies, that can be important, like the STEM-based understanding. But essentially the work of sustainability isn't completely just looking at the environmental sphere. I think the social and cultural and political sphere are just as important. So I think, it really doesn't matter in this point in time, because we've kind of expanded our understanding of sustainability to be intersectional, where we need to look at multiple different modalities to understand how sustainability can take place. Just pick your lane and stick with it. Like I have some amazing friends that are engineering majors, and they have, really brought in a lens of sustainability to that work, about thinking of equity for communities, building access. So it could honestly be anything, and you could apply the tenets of sustainability to everything, because I think so much sustainability is in the realm of like liberal arts and social sciences, and it doesn't exist in these STEM fields, and that needs to change as well.
Yes. And I think it's okay to kind of mix and match too. Like, as you said, you have a couple of different areas of study that you combine to create now that helped equip you for your role now. Because there's a lot of folks who come to me and say, like, I didn't go to fashion school. Like, what do I do? And I'm like, I didn't go to fashion school either. I actually, similar to you, I was a sociology of world development major. So I got to really understand these like kind of international relationships. And then I was also an ethnic studies minor and a communications minor. So similar kind of lanes, but all of those now, it's funny because when I was studying those in the beginning, my family members were like, what are you going to do with that? And I'm like, well, now I could legitimately say I use all of it. So anyway, let's get to the meat of our conversation today. How would you define intersectional sustainability in your words?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, first I'd want to take a step back and kind of define intersectionality. And so intersectionality was a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, I think it was. And Kimberly Crenshaw was a phenomenal critical race theory scholar and civil rights advocate. And what intersectionality really means is that we're looking at the different domains that make up our identities. So that's gender, that's race, socioeconomic status, ableism, or ability, and all of those things kind of inform our relationship to the world and the world's relationship to us. And so intersectionality was, predominantly used in the context to feminism. Mm-hmm. So intersectional feminism was one that sought to acknowledge the unique struggles that people had in relation to their womanhood. And the feminism of a white woman won't necessarily be my, feminism, because we have different struggles and lived experiences. And so now taking that framework and language to the realm of sustainability means that when we look at sustainability and folks' relationship to the natural earth and everything else within that domain, there is no one size fits all or monolithic understanding of what sustainability is and how it should take place. My relationship to sustainability has been deeply informed by my South Asian identity in the context of a lot of my work is about unlearning the colonial, violence that was done to my community, unlearning these approaches rooted in exploitation and extraction, a return to ancestral knowledge where I'm from. And so intersectional sustainability, which has now, generally been used as intersectional environmentalism, is about, we can't look at the issues of sustainability or environmentalism as purely like environmental issues. It's the fact that the cultural, political, and social elements of this are all deeply embedded, and we have to look at both. And I think, looking at this through the context of like a climate justice framework really allows us to look at the root of the issue. Like sustainability isn't just about addressing an excess of carbon in our environment. It's about what are the systems in place that created that? What are the communities that are disproportionately impacted as a result of that? And what is the historical context that made their lives a lot more disposable than, say, another race? All of those questions are so important, because otherwise, this work is too layered and nuanced to just be about too much carbon in the earth.
And not to mention that a lot of the people who are on the front lines of climate change in terms of how they're affected by it are generally vulnerable communities that happen to be Black and Brown communities. So it's absolutely important to really think about an intersectional lens to sustainability. And I really love that I learned that term from you. Because I was like, oh yeah, that is exactly how I look at it too. And now there's a name that I could place on it. So
yeah, and I think you hit it in the head. I mean, so many people were doing the work of and seeing things in an intersectional framework, but sometimes having that language just helps in establishing that we need to approach it in that way.
Yeah, and it also unites me with the kind of people who, like you and all the other people that I'm seeing now using the term. It helps me to kind of identify who my tribe is in this space, and that feels really good as well. So as you know, we've got the US elections coming up. A lot of people have election anxiety, including myself. And there's also a lot of people who know that they hate Trump and want to vote him out, but they're not necessarily inspired by, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. They're really lukewarm on that. And there's some people who don't believe in voting at all. What would you say to those people who feel that way?
Yeah. It's a good question. And in this critical moment for both people and the planet, it's important to know that, look, there is no perfect candidate, but using that as the means to opt out of voting is a privilege, because for many communities of color, we've never had that perfect candidate, but we continue to show up. And so voting in itself won't necessarily fix everything, but voting does inform the type of environment that we will continue to organize in as climate justice advocates. So with that in mind, Biden and Harris might not be your perfect candidate, but they do acknowledge the climate catastrophe and they will prioritize it. And that in itself is so important, because as folks that are organizing in this space, that will inform the work we'll continue to do. Voting in itself won't save us, but voting is key as an act of civic engagement. And there's so much on the line. I mean, the last 4 years of the Trump presidencies, we've seen over 100 environmental rollbacks. So much violence against Black and Brown and Indigenous communities on a social, political, and environmental level. And so those are all things to acknowledge, because, voting will directly impact the future of all of that as well.
at the very basic level, having an administration that acknowledges, as you said, climate change, that sounds so basic, but it's, and now that I live abroad, right, there's so many people who are just looking at America, like, how do you not acknowledge science? It's just absolutely bonkers. So yeah, first step, let's have an administration that actually thinks it's a real thing. How about that?
So it's a pretty low bar, unfortunately.
Right, pretty low bar, pretty basic stuff, but unfortunately, that's what we're fighting for. The election is also so much more than national politics. I know that you've gotten involved with a couple of local measures or California-based measures. So I believe you were advocating for a measure that was supporting garment workers a few months ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your thoughts on participating in local and state politics in addition to the presidential ones?
Yes. Local and state politics are so important because, there's so many circumstances and location-specific elements that we need to consider, and like what is working and what is not. Yeah. A lot of my work in the last 3 to 4 years in the LA garment scene has been supporting the resistance of garment workers in LA. And I'll take a step back and kind of give some context of what that industry looks like. So in Los Angeles, the second biggest industry is actually the cut and sew garment industry. It employs anywhere from 45,000 to 50,000 individuals. But that is a figure that's probably a gross underestimation of how many folks are actually working in the industry, because 45 to 50,000 is the number from registered factories. Moreover, the industry is largely an underground informal economy, and most of the workers are undocumented immigrants, which means that it creates this dynamic and setup where, workers' identities are routinely weaponized against them. Mm-hmm. So instances where they do attempt to speak out, they will be threatened from their employers with deportation from ICE, which is illegal, but it's a form of worker intimidation. Also, the Los Angeles garment industry is largely operating on the piece rate, which means that workers are being paid per piece they make as opposed to the hour. This piece rate is often as low as 2 to 3 cents. And so in the work that organizations like the Garment Worker Center has done, which is a labor rights organization. Can you hear that?
A little bit.
Dollars. Think about that in the cost of living in a city like Los Angeles. And so one recent act that we had attempted to pass was the Garment Worker Protection Act. So introduce COVID into the mix, and folks that are already experiencing sweatshop conditions are further exacerbated with, a lack of ventilation, let alone social distancing. Okay, so I think this should be better.
Okay, wonderful. Welcome back.
Sorry about that. But yes, so the industry in Los Angeles, the average hourly rate is about $6 an hour. And this act that was introduced would do a few things. It would eradicate the piece rate, making it that, workers are all paid at least the minimum wage, which, again, this is not anything radical. It's very baseline things. It would also create a culture of accountability where factories are directly accountable as well as the brands. So right now we have a culture where brands are subcontracting orders to factories to fulfill. And when there's instances of labor abuse, and the worker goes to the labor court, the factory will blame the brand as the reason they paid us these rates. And then the brand will blame the factory, and there's no culture of accountability. But this would create a direct line of accountability through all of those bodies, which is so, so important. Yeah. Unfortunately, this, act, it went through the Assembly, it went through the Senate. And so it was at the last step where it needed that final vote to become a reality. And the clock struck 12, so it wasn't prioritized. It wasn't ended up voting on. So it's something that, the fight will continue in 2021. But I think that's an example of, local policies that you should support, because the implications of this on such a large workforce that is now deemed essential because they're producing masks and things like that. But these lives are not being prioritized. We've seen COVID outbreaks in a number of factories. We've seen instances where workers themselves are not given masks, despite the fact and the irony that they're producing masks and are essential workers. And so all of those things are incredibly important to keep in mind. And I think the other important thing is this is an example of worker-led sustainability. Within the sustainability domain, we talk a lot about corporate social responsibility, which is important, but corporate social responsibility is often framed by voluntary efforts that are self-audited, et cetera. But worker-led responsibility or worker-led sustainability is really about, having workers establish what they need and creating legally binding documents that create this culture of accountability.
Yes, and that's why it's really important to pay attention to local politics, because a lot of times, as you said, things are geographically specific, and there are a lot of things in the national elections that are obviously important, but that's where you get the granular things done in the local elections. So please pay attention to local politics as well. And my next question is actually about, your news sources. As a speaker on this topic, I'm sure you have to be quite well informed. What are some of your trusted sources?
Yeah, for things in sustainability specifically, or more so just like in what domain?
Let's do sustainability and then also like kind of just world and, American affairs.
Yeah, I would say one of my favorite publications is Yes Magazine. They are a solutions-based publication. So they're talking about all of these things from racial to climate justice, but they also provide a lot of insights of what the solutions will look like to these issues. And so it's a good balance of both real-time education, but also hope and seeing folks that are doing the work and making an impact as well.
I love that because it can be really depressing to read the news. So I like the idea of having a solutions-based magazine. That's a really good idea. And I think to add to that, do you also read your local paper as well?
Yeah, local papers are definitely something of the utmost importance. Support local journalism. These are the folks that are, routinely going to city council meetings and providing folks with that updates. In the context of like the garment workers scene and that work I do, I'm lucky enough to be connected with the folks that are doing this work, so that I can have like a first person source there. But yeah, local journalism is so key, and I could say that as a journalism grad that it's so important to support those folks.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's local journalists who are breaking some of the things that make it into the national news first. So, and they don't have as many resources. So I appreciate that we can both support local journalism as well. Now, let's go back to the conversation around young people who might be aspiring to follow the path that you're on. What is your advice for other aspiring influencers so that their work can go beyond performative activism?
That's a great question, especially in an age where I think Instagram is becoming increasingly saturated. And so I think the first thing I would do, instead of just having a knee-jerk reaction of, I want to be an influencer, is really study the space that you want to occupy and look at what are the perspectives that are not being talked about right now. And I think, making that from a business perspective, like your value proposition, but also what needs to be heard that hasn't in this space. I also think doing your research, a lot of the times the way we're consuming content is largely on social media, but really doing your due diligence to look at the back end, look at the history, and that will inform the first question or, thing that I posed about adding your specific voice. I also think, on a more practical note, Instagram is such a visual platform. And so thinking about beautiful visuals or accessible graphics is so key. Something we've seen the rise of in the last few months or even years is like these explainers or infographics on Instagram. And I think that's such a cool way to make, this information accessible to the masses. And the other thing I would say is always try and draw connections to larger systems of oppression and what you want to talk about. So, when I first started in the sustainable fashion scene, something that kind of rubbed me the wrong way was the way that the solution to, the issues of human rights abuses in fashion was often buy your way into a new reality. And that's not to say that I don't see the importance of conscious consumerism, but the way it was framed made it so that if you wanted to engage in the sustainable fashion movement, you had to buy your way into it. And as a person who, has a low income background, it just felt like it was making the movement a lot more exclusionary. So always thinking about inclusivity as a key pillar of the work that you want to produce and the messages that you want to support is really important as well.
Yeah. And are there any other offline activities that maybe you could talk about? Because I know that as a photojournalist, you have to engage with garment workers on a face-to-face basis or a one-on-one basis. So I think that's really important in regards to informing your work and your involvement. I think it's just, if you have other offline kind of work that you do, I think that's also important, because I think that, yes, we're living in a digital space right now, but what are the ways that we can kind of take the action offline?
Yeah, that's a great point. The fact that we need to think beyond Instagram. Instagram is a means to an end to get information out there. I don't think the goal should ever be to be just an Instagram influencer. And that's not to undermine the power and potential of Instagram, but it's a medium. It is not the end goal. And so I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is I never set out necessarily to be an Instagram influencer or whatever the term is, but the work that I was doing as an activist or educator in the space lent itself well to that. So yeah, whether that is grassroots organizing, whether that is a journalistic capacity, or the work you're doing in your 9-to-5 job, like all of those can intersect in different ways.
Yeah.
Another note on like performative activism, I think performative activism is kind of using the language and tools and proximity to a movement, but not actually doing the work. So make sure that you're holding your friends and families accountable, having those difficult conversations.
Yeah.
But the flip side to that is, whenever you're someone doing work in the online space, there will always be folks that will call your work performative because they don't know what happens beyond the keyboard. And so I think you also kind of have to develop thick skin to know that you personally have to have conviction in the work you're doing, both on and offline. And not just like, people are going to say things. It just comes with the space, to be honest.
Absolutely. And when you get to a certain point, it just becomes inevitable, right? So I like the enforcing of thick skin, because as a public figure, I'm sure that you're starting to see a lot of different voices coming in your direction.
Most definitely.
Yeah. So you're also part of a new platform, Intersectional Environmentalism. Can you share more about that and how we can get involved?
Yes. So intersectional environmentalism is an amazing movement/platform. The term intersectional environmentalism was coined by my friend Leah Thomas a few months ago, and it kind of had this viral moment. But it's very much similar to the definition of intersectional sustainability that we spoke about personally. And so Intersectional Environmentalism, the platform, was kind of born out of this viral moment where everyone was looking for resources of BIPOC folks in this space to follow the lead of and get their insights on, but they were saying, I don't know where to find them. So we're like, okay, let's fix that for you. So at the moment, Intersectional Environmentalism, the website, it's intersectionalenvironmentalist.com. There are different community and topic pages that will break down different concepts or talk about sustainability through the realm of a South Asian person, for instance, and different resources, different organizations to support, and people to follow in that space. So it is an amazing directory in that capacity. And then, what's next for intersectional environmentalism is we're going to kind of operate as a media house. So a lot of content, weekly content with video to personal essays, and just, continuing the work of amplifying folks in the space that have always been doing the work, but maybe didn't have that recognition or visibility that they needed. And so it's only been a few months since this movement was born, but, especially in this time of COVID, the sense of community that has come about of folks doing the same type of work, it's just the most gratifying thing. And so I think that's a great online and hopefully one day in real life space that folks can engage with during this time if they want to learn more.
Fantastic. Awesome, Aditi. Well, we're coming to the end of our conversation, but before we go, can you share where folks can find you and how we can follow along your journey?
Yes. So you can find me on Instagram at Aditi Meyer. My website is addimay.com. And if you follow me on any of those platforms, you will see this work, whether that is my journalistic work, the content creation, to the organizing. And some point in 2021, I'm really excited to be a National Geographic Fellow. So I'll be spending 1 year in India documenting the fashion supply chain from agriculture, manufacturing to end-of-life textile waste. So that's what you can see.
That is very exciting. So thank you so much, Aditi, for taking the time to joining us today from Los Angeles. I really appreciate your work, and I'll be continuing to follow along and cheering you on as well. And for those who tuned in, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to spend with Aditi and I. I broadcast every week on here on Grit and Glamour, and I hope that we will see you on the next episode. Until then, here's to all the grit behind the glamour. Bye.